So just a heads up. So we should now be recording. So welcome everyone. The plan for this is that I have a short presentation that just goes through a little bit about copyright and fair use as it stands normally, and then how we can apply it to right now. And then we'll have some time to talk a little bit more about any questions that you have or how to make those decisions. So I'm going to also switch this to share my screen so you can see this presentation. And there we go. And thanks everyone for your patience as I try to figure out how Zoom works. So to get us started, let's see. Let me just switch this view. There we go. So to get us started, this is just about copyright and fair use, and specifically at this point, as the standard disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. I'm also not your lawyer, and this is not legal advice. I've watched a number of webinars and been reading up specifically on copyright and fair use right at this time. And so I wanted to share what I've learned with everyone so that you have that at your disposal as well, but it's not legal advice. So the first section is just copyright and fair use generally. So copyright, according to the Constitution, says that the Congress shall have the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for a limited time to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. So it is allowing people to use their things alone instead of letting other people use them. But it is with the purpose of promoting progress and creativity. So fair use is when copyright and those restrictions would hinder the progress and creativity of science and useful arts. So when we're looking at fair use, that is the copying of copyrighted material done for a limited and transformative purpose, such as to comment upon, criticize, or parody a copyrighted work. In our case, often education is that transformative purpose. And so we look at it kind of through that lens, although the fact that something is educational doesn't necessarily make it a fair use of a copyrighted material. So there are 4 factors that we always need to consider, and as we go through these, there's not going to be an obvious direct answer for everything, but it will point us in the right direction to see if our use is a fair use. So the first one is the purpose and character of your use. We want to know what you're doing, why you're doing it. The second is the nature of the copyrighted work, what it's like, what its form is. The third is the amount and substantiality of the portion taken, so how much of it are we using? And the final is the effect and the use upon the potential, the effect of the use upon the potential market. So are we preventing people from paying for the copyrighted work because of our use? So how can you be sure? The short answer is that you can't. Only a judge, when a case goes to trial, will actually be able to tell definitively if that was a fair use of the copyrighted material. But that shouldn't stop us from making a good faith effort to make sure that what we're doing is a fair use, and to kind of document what our thinking is, to kind of keep us on the right side of the law here. It is up to us to figure that out almost all of the time. There is a really useful checklist. This is produced by Kenneth Cruz, who is at Columbia University, and it goes through each one of those 4 factors and kind of putting a number of things under favoring fair use, number of things under opposing fair use, and you can go through each one of these segments, checking off which ones apply in your case. And again, it's not going to be like a quiz on Cosmo where you add up your points and you have your definitive answer at the end, but it does let you kind of see where on each line you're falling. Given our current situation, we need to ask a few particular questions that are different than normal. So the first one is the purpose. We want to ask, is it educational? Again, that's not going to be a definitive yes for a fair use, but it's an important aspect to look at. And is this the content the best or only option to teach this material or concept? So do we have equally good or better materials that aren't copyrighted that we could be using instead? Or is this really the best option? Now, in our case, it might be that it's the best option because it's what we've been using this semester. It doesn't have to be, you know, knowing that we're going online maybe in the future, would you choose it again? We're looking from this moment. We chose this textbook because it was the textbook we wanted to use. Students had access to it. It was totally fair. A lot of them were buying it. But at this point, we might just need to continue using it, even if that means making some copies of it for students that don't have access at this point. And that's the best option at this moment in these circumstances. The second aspect that we want to look at is the nature of the work. It tends to be more highly looked at as a fair use if it's factual or nonfiction information. Fiction or creative works tend to be seen as less likely to be a fair use, although if the educational purpose is using fictional works, that wouldn't necessarily, again, block it from being a fair use. Is it really relevant to you? Is it published? Unpublished works are less likely to be a fair use because the author has the right to introduce it to the public for the first time. And do you have an alternative that you could use that would be just as good? The third aspect is the amount and duration. So how long will it be available? If it's only available for the next few weeks while we finish up the semester, that's a nice short time period. To whom will it be available? If it's only available in your Canvas course, that's also a nice limited number of people. You wouldn't want to be sending copies of materials out to the full student body for eternity. But again, a nice restricted use. Will it be used repeatedly? So is this something that you're intending to use next semester as well, whether you're in person or online? Again, with this kind of single weird situation that we're in, it's very likely that something that you're copying would fall into a fair use category for it's only being used this once, we're only copying it for this time. And the kind of odd one at this moment is how much are you using? So again, we're looking at what is pedagogically relevant. And if you are using half of a book, that might typically be too much of the book. But in this moment, if that's the amount that you're going to be teaching from for the rest of the semester, then that might be the pedagogically appropriate amount to copy. So it could even sometimes be an entire work in this odd moment. Because that's the amount that you're teaching. Conversely, if you're only going to be using a chapter from the book, you would not want to be distributing the full book for them to use. It's really the same when it comes to videos and other materials as well. It doesn't have to be a book. If you can excerpt it, that's better. If you need the whole thing because we found ourselves in a strange pickle here, that may be all right for fair use. And finally is the effect. A few questions to consider. If you are already in possession of it legally, it puts you in firmer footing for making copies of it. How many copies you're making. So are you sending it to everyone or just a few people? And would students be purchasing it at this point? Typically, you wouldn't want to copy a full textbook because students would be buying the book if they didn't have the copies you might have distributed. But at this point, students have really already made their decisions about whether they're buying a book, and they may not have the option to purchase it at this point, especially as they've lost employment. Amazon is overloaded, the bookstore is on campus and the students aren't. So it may not have much of any effect on the commercial endeavor of selling an item simply because of where we are in the semester, and this was unforeseen. And finally, are you able to use it in a licensed or freely available setting? So if there's a freely available option that you could be using, and you're using the version that is copyrighted, if you can just switch to that freely available version, then that's going to put you on much firmer footing rather than making copies of something that you had an alternative to that would not have affected your pedagogical mission. So All that being said, you're not going to come up with an exact answer, but it's really taking into account those 4 factors of use: the purpose, nature, amount, and effect. Again, that's the purpose of your use, the nature of the work, the amount of the work, and the effect on the marketplace if you do make or distribute that copy. And so you'll be able to determine at that point whether you believe that this is a fair use of the copyrighted material. And again, this is really regardless of the format. Copyright doesn't really treat different materials differently in this way. The only thing that it requires is that it's a tangible kind of stationary thing. So if I were giving this talk in person, that would not be a copyrighted work at all. But the fact that I'm recording this and it will be posted would make it something that is protected. And you would then need to consider the fair use of it. So considering all these options, what you think is really what matters at this moment. Using something like the checklist that I'll also distribute, and there's a link to it at the end of this, is a great way to kind of document your thinking and help you consider all of these different considerations at this moment, and then have that for the future if anyone ever questions you on whether this was a fair use. So with that, that was my very brief presentation just to kind of get us on the same footing and share some of how we can think about this generally and in this particular situation. So I'd love to open it up at this moment for all of you to ask, talk about what you're considering or what copies you're wishing to make or have made or what have you. So I'll switch this back into our normal mode. And feel free to use the chat box or your microphones. You'll just want to unmute yourself before you ask. Yeah, so Kyle, you're asking about TED Talks and whether those are copyrighted. Those are often freely available on YouTube. So sending somebody or the whole class the link or embedding that YouTube video in a course would be a fine thing to do. That's something that they've decided to make freely available, so it wouldn't be a concern. Does that answer your question, or did you have a specific situation where it might be not available? Okay, so that looks like that answered that question. So yeah, if something is freely available online and you're linking to it, then that's free for linking to or recommending people use. Downloading it and distributing it outside of that environment might be a little different situation, but freely available online is great for linking. One thing to consider too is that the library has a lot of ebooks and articles and newspapers and whatnot. Those are all things that we have the license to use. We've bought that through our subscriptions. So again, linking to that material or even downloading it for use this semester in your courses is a perfectly fine thing to do. The only consideration is that you wouldn't necessarily want to have that copy that you would be distributing for lots of future semesters if our subscription changed, but that's fairly unlikely. We have a nice firm set of them. So Kyle's also asking about downloading TED Talks for offline use, potentially for taking on crews. So credit for the video is a nice thing to do. It doesn't really affect fair use, but I think that, again, considering that it's an educational purpose for a limited period of time to a very specific group of people who you might be showing it to in the situation where you wouldn't have online access. So that's kind of taken off the table as an option. That sounds like a pretty fair use of that. Anyone else have any questions? It's a really fun time to suddenly switch to online teaching. So with that, I'm just going to switch to share my screen again, just to show you, let's see, hopefully that's the right one, show you some of the resources that I recommend. I'll post this as well on our online teaching resource guide, so I'll send that to each of you. There's the Columbia University checklist. That's a great document for thinking through this. One webinar that I found especially helpful is called Yes, You Can Scan That Textbook, and it is specifically about this moment, not about generally. But if you want a little bit more information about this, that's where I got that information. And then there's also a public statement of library and copyright specialists specifically about fair use. So that is helpful. Thanks, Kyle. He says that this was helpful. So with that, I'm just going to write down your name so that I can make sure to send you this material and point you to the link. Do feel free to reach out to me at any point about this. I'm trying to keep on top of this very rapidly changing situation. The great thing is that since copyright and fair use are such kind of wiggly wobbly topics, it's not like it's always banned. It's just something that can adjust to the situation. So thank you all and have a great day.